Hi, I'm Leslie Helpert, and the following is part of a series called The Mechanics of Self-Trust. If you don't have the entire series of nearly 20 conversations yet, you can get them all for free by simply going to dynamicvoicetraining.com/conversation series.html. That is dynamicvoicetraining.com/conversation series.html. Thanks so much. Enjoy.
I want to warmly welcome you, Terry Bohn, into this collective conversation on the mechanics of self-trust. Thank you so much for joining me here during this time. I'm so honored.
Thank you, Leslie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview of how I found your work because it feels so lovely and an expression of how sometimes when we just follow our creative curiosity, we land upon these wonderful gems. I was interested in understanding more about the limbic system and the limbic brain, particularly. I was just doing a Google search of podcasting and I stumbled upon a podcast that Terry had done, I think in 2018. And I loved hearing your voice, Terry. I loved the warmth that I heard there. I loved the pacing and the pitch, as I shared with you, because I'm a composer. I realized, and in my studies too, how much our body systems organize around the voices that we hear, the sounds we hear, and something about your pace allows my pace to slow down. I've noticed in having connected with you before this interview, more than just his captivating voice, Terry, your content I really loved the presence I felt in your sharing, and I know that you have, from my knowledge, done much work around how presence can inform moving through trauma. So you do, as a professional clinician, counselor, and therapeutic support, supporting people to move through trauma. So I'd love you to kind of talk a little bit about how you describe what you do, because you'll surely do it better than I could. And also, I just wanted to say that you're meeting us right now from your home space in Colorado. So, yay.
That was a great introduction. I am a private practice therapist and clinical supervisor in both Colorado and in Washington State, where I did my grad work. I do corporate consulting for organizations that are managing change, particularly on a relational level. We're all managing some sort of changes in our country, our political system, in our communities, and that change is embodied. We carry that. And as you and I spoke previously, very briefly earlier this week, for a lot of folks, that's evoked emotion and discomfort. And to the degree that it has been at times too much for some people, I would call that trauma on some level. And the ability to both recognize feeling overwhelmed, confused, frustrated, highly anxious, worried, burned out, fatigued, emotionally, physically, relationally, is really where I feel like some clients do their best work. They're stuck, or they're just simply unable to do life the way that they would like, and perhaps the way that they're used to. So my work with folks professionally and sometimes spiritually inside those sessions is really learning to pay attention to one's story chronologically and existentially as I sit with folks, and to notice the dynamic that comes up when we sit with someone else in person, and now increasingly for a lot of us virtually and electronically, and how different those two are, and how many folks have said they've spent much more time in Zoom meetings and conference calls, and how differently tired they are at the end of the day versus being in an office that has energy and has connection and presence. So I think that's a great word choice that you used.
What inspires me, inspiration kind of comes in shapes. And so you just gave such a good core, and I see these different directions. So I'm going to go into one area that you mentioned now. One of many of the arms of interest that sparked for me has to do with working with organizations and organizations. And I know that before you were doing therapy, you came from a position of being like in an executive, working in that sort of collective space. And this is an area that really fascinates me, because I think as we navigate change, the space of our organizations are going to support how much healing work we can do depending on how they're organized and what they deem as important, and how we relate to each other, even within that space. And just as much as we're recognizing that there are these outworn aspects of our cultural divisions, there are different like hierarchies that have existed in structure too, that sometimes makes an employee feel like they're just some low-runged person on the bottom and they can't reach communicating with the top person. So I think it's so important to be able to have these systemic dialogues about how the organization of a company together navigates change. And in the same way, do you find a lot of similarity in just working with an individual and then looking at an organization like a larger entity, like a larger individual?
All the time. You know, we are born into relationship physically with our birth mother and our family of origin and extended family, friends, neighbors, classmates. It's rare where we are not in relationship from the very beginning. And for many of us, that continues. Many of us work in co-working spaces or shared spaces where we collaborate, and it's wonderful when it works. But what I increasingly hear from folks is the difficulty in having uncomfortable conversations where there are multiple priorities or mixed agendas, or simply the organization has to go in one direction and the individual's talents and skills aren't best lined up, but they have a mortgage and they have a family and they have responsibility, and so they do the work. And maybe they're really good at it, but often it drains them. And sometimes it really deadens their soul. So we really don't have to spend a lot of time talking about effective organizations and healthy organizations, because they already know how to do this. They're familiar and fluent. But what we're talking to is the majority of people who they want a different experience, either at work or in relationship, at home, or now virtually, because the social collateral and the social currency is we're wearing literal masks and we're 6 feet apart or more, but none of this feels normal yet to people. So I don't work in a corporate space formally, but I work with those folks who do, and particularly these last several months, they have found the difficulty in navigating what feels like uncharted, uncertain waters.
What is it that helps people find deeper meaning without having to necessarily change or quit their job?
Well, in our previous conversation, I mentioned the word integration. And it's also sort of a almost metaphorical intersection of who we are and how and where we show up 8, 9, 10 or more hours a day to do, right? We get paid to do, to perform in some capacity. And some of us love how we perform because we've been really intentional and we've chosen a field that has deep resonance with who we are and our own story. And a lot of folks, they have to go into an office, and I can imagine people saying, well, that's great for you, Terry. That's great for you, Leslie. You're following your dream. I think both of us could say that. What do we say to the folks that have to do what they do because they have responsibilities and they have needs of various levels? I would say that what has really been paramount for me is what has caught on the last 10 or 15 years increasingly, and that's emotional intelligence. And that's really paying attention to one word that you used, interoception, noticing how we are, how we're doing, how we're feeling, what we're thinking, and then judgments that we make, whether they're silent stories that we tell ourselves or outbursts, at the office that hopefully don't happen. But occasionally, a colleague will roll their eyes or they'll turn away, and we're already creating a story about that interaction. And so, if there were a simple answer to your question, I would say, wow, there's some really good work being done in emotional intelligence on an individual level, on a relational level, and on a corporate level, where people are really learning how to say uncomfortable things in safer ways so that each of them can grow in various forms.
I want to go into interoception because another part of me wants to go into like the workforce and things like transparent culture, like corporations like or like the hedge fund Bridgewater, which is all about like you just say what you need to say and you kind of learn to adjust to that culture. But because that's such a giant area for me, and I'll basically want you to tell me, well, what's the solution? How do we create better jobs where people are already kind of liking them, and like how do we basically do therapy on the whole entire infrastructure, and how are we going to do this, Terry? I think that one of the things that is probably better for me as far as like staying grounded is to go into interoception, because the theme of this conversation is the mechanics of self-trust. Let's talk about what interoception really is, because it is a series of functions and inferences that play out in ourself that kind of determine our reckoning or our awareness, or how we're basically naming what's happening. So what is it? Tell us more.
Well, this is not a clinical, psychological, formal opinion. This is my opinion, my definition. The readiness, the willingness, and the ability to pay attention to me first and know how I'm bringing myself to other people and other experiences. And it's paramount, right? If I'm not aware of how I'm coming across, I'm communicating a message that I really don't intend. But if I can slow down and pay attention to my own process and say, boy, Leslie, that is a fantastic question. I could go 10 different ways. But what I want to do is say, what have I found helpful, both in my personal life, my relational lives, my clinical work, and really just good connection with people, something that we experienced from the outside of just being able to say, boy, it's nice just to show up and be curious and be aware and want to get to know the other person which is a lot of what's happening in this country, but starting with me. So readiness, willing, and ability to pay attention to me first and how I bring myself.
And I love this idea too of interoception happening in the places we get hung up when we're alone. So for me, for example, I'm just thinking of places that I've been doing personal work of growing through certain things, for much of my life. There's certain areas where I'm like, oh yeah, I've got that. And other areas where I'm just still so new at figuring things out. Or I'll learn and I'll forget again and learn again. I'm really good with that one. So I think it's interesting too, we're relating to our environment and our environment's responding to us even if we're alone. For example, if I stumble out of bed and I stub my toe and I say, darn it, and then I fall into a bookshelf, whatever, something like this. It all started with before I even got out of bed, right? Like the whole energy of my relationship. And that probably, I'm just making up this example. This fortunately hasn't happened as of late, but that, probably started from a certain sensation I was feeling in the body. And maybe that sensation felt too complicated to name, or I just never got the vocabulary for it. How do we start naming sensations? I mean, it sounds so easy. Oh, this is hot, this is cold. But wouldn't you say that most of us are kind of not really that connected sometimes to even how we're feeling or to be able to know what it is?
Well, I love that you brought in environment, because for somebody who is paying attention to themselves and there's not an other in the room at that moment, we still have a relationship with ourselves. And increasingly, I think there are certain fields and practices and disciplines and coaches out there that are talking about precisely what you've invited, trusting ourselves. But if we don't have a self to begin with, if we don't realize that we are the captain of our own ship and that I'm creating that self in all the experiences that I have, whether that's alone or with one or many other people, then it's going to be really hard then to locate ourselves internally. So I love the word self-trust.
Well, I love this area we're going into, and I really want to kind of stay in it. And it's funny because it's like my tendency, I think just even like knowing that here we are together, right? And yet I'm going to be airing this. So there's like a third energy, a third entity, and I really want to give the heart of our collective offering to them. And so I can, in a way, feel myself, feel our connection, and feel that presence too. And then, so there's so many different pieces to get aware of. But the reason I said that is because I'm going to ask you to help me stay in this specific intersection for our conversation, because this is exactly what I want to talk about. This is exactly the work. So this whole piece of being able to feel our being. We oftentimes go to work, you said this before, and it's a place where we're getting hired to do. When we talk about the systems at large, like workspace or space with ourselves, there is something we're recognizing. And I do think it's been one of those interesting gifts out of what is happening right now, that there's something in the unseen and there's something in the non-doing. Many of us have had a very serious change in our rituals and regimes that defined us from the outside in. So we've had to begin to conceive of being more resourceful with a different currency. And maybe we could call that being. And maybe in that sense of interoception, that ability to start saying, I can change my relationship with myself. And have you seen that sort of surfacing for people in this process, where people are starting to kind of consider how they're being more than how they're doing?
Yes, and I've noticed it the most in myself, right? I'm a person. I'm not just a therapist. I'm not just a consultant. I've noticed the rhythms that I've needed to say, who am I today? Who am I going to be? not for my clients, not for my practice, not for the community. Who am I today? Who am I going to bring to the conversations? And even if it's the conversation that I'm having in my head in the pool, there's still a dialogue. There's still a story and an arc of how important it is to locate oneself and to have a self, and a self that you want to get to know, and a self that you can have kindness towards rather than judgment and contempt, and simply powering through and doing more.
Whoa, I just had a thought about that. So from personal experience, and I think I can speak from the perspective of many women, we can feel like we're really in this place of self. You know, maybe I have certain identities where I love drinking water out of a mason jar. Like, who knows? And then there's a moment where we consider all the million other lifestyles or million other opinions out there. There are these different places where it's like we literally lose access to being able to be with self. What's the difference between identifying who we are and being like, well, I'm this and I'm that, and then just knowing yourself in a way where you can change and you can have resilience and you can also have boundary where you are not going to collapse underneath anyone else's identity or what they think your identity should be? What's the difference between identity and self?
Wow, great question. I don't know that it's the difference, but perhaps the blend or the integration of the two for me is mind. Because if I'm mindful and I'm choosing rather than reacting, then my mind is taking both in what it's like to be with you and what you're asking, what perhaps I need to do to perform, to get the question right, to do the task right. So I think it's a wonderful question that I won't even come close to doing justice to, because it's big. We could do an entire episode on what you've just asked. For me, what lies in the middle is having a perspective of being mindful about how I bring myself.
Would you say that being mindful almost necessitates having identified what our values are?
Certainly helps.
Are there ways that people can get to know themselves without having to do like real deep introspective work that isn't necessitating like outside information or identity, but it's just like other ways? Like, how do people get to know themselves rather than necessarily having to like break down all these pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question. Assuming for a moment that they want to, right? That it's not someone else's agenda or demand. But I've done really good work with clients around a particular story. It's an unresolved conflict. And I could share an example, but at a sort of a kind of a generic level first. We engage differently with ourselves when we write the story out, whether that's pen on paper or fingers on keyboard. We are processing, we know that the body and the brain process that story differently once it leaves literally the interior, right? Because now we're composing a story for someone else, or in the case of a journal, for ourselves, so we can go back and look at this story. And did it play out that way? Or is this just one way that it could be seen as it played out? But I do remarkable story work with courageous men and women and couples who are willing to say, yeah, I could do that. It doesn't involve my childhood. It's not regressive work, but it is an ability to say, this thing happened a couple weeks ago with my spouse. And even if I'm working with them individually, I'll have them tell me the story once verbally, and then they don't know this unless now they hear this episode, this interview. They'll write that story out, and there'll be just enough of a difference and a nuance of how that story now manifests on paper, per se. And I go in my work and I comment on the story as it's written. So it may be 2 pages long. I don't change the story, but I comment to the side, like perhaps some of us experienced in our academic life. And now we've got 2 versions. We've got their version and we've got my interpretation. And then they have my interpretation that they're bringing in and folding in with their experience. And now we can have a dialogue about what it's like to say, this is what I wrote, but is it what I really meant? So doesn't have to be years in psychoanalysis, doesn't have to be months on end of weekly appointments. We can do great story work in 2-4 hours, depending on how a client wants to navigate that. And what often is the case is they're finding how surprised they are at the fun that they can have. That it's not repressive, hard, traumatizing, but eye-opening. That they're now curious. Oh, I didn't see that my wife, my friend, my colleague saw it this way. And I love that aha moment when people say, oh my goodness, that's growth. That's one way that I've seen it happen.
Do you think that when we don't have the opportunity to transform from chronic patterns in relationship, it really doesn't matter the new company that we get involved with, or the new partner, or the new dog that we now own after our other dog died, or whatever? There's going to be a similar dynamic until we learn how to recognize it and to shift it within ourselves.
For many people, it's unconscious and unintentional, but they're bringing the same old self. And if they're not aware of it, and it starts to manifest in the same old ways, it's kind of having a bad picker when you date. Why do we choose the same person over and over and over in a hopeful, romantic way? Or in this case, as you said, going to a new company, and we've realized that it's not them, it's me. But it doesn't have to be filled with scorn and shame and ridicule. It can be, I have an opportunity to grow here. So I've done, prior to doing my current clinical work and some consulting work, just helping people see how they participate, how they engage. Sometimes that's team building exercise, but sometimes it's just really informal coaching of, what do you want to work on? What do you want to talk about? Oh, I got to tell you about this thing that blew up last week with my boss. How many times have we been in that situation? But we're bringing an old version of ourselves, like an outdated operating system. And often, most painfully, we're just not aware of it.
There's so many different facets to the reasoning behind holding on to patterns, because they are, tell us why. Why do we hold on to patterns?
Because they work. They allow us to survive. When the uncertain world that we're navigating right now, financially, culturally, spiritually, relationally, physically, medically, when all of that doesn't have certainty for tomorrow, then I just want to get through today.
And everybody does relate to different, to diverse ways of learning. So there's a level of like, how do we bring in mindful awareness for people where they are, meet people where they are? Is that an important piece in the way companies want to shift their culture or the way they work with each other?
Assuming that the individual wants to participate, yeah. But if your boss comes to you and says, all 8 of you are going through some forced team building development exercise on Friday, and or worse, on Saturday, on your day off, or tonight, if the person's not wanting to engage that, they're going to show up so differently. And so I think we start, like I invite a lot of people who've either had bad counseling or no counseling. I say, the best version of you that's going to show up is the version that wants to find a way that has healthy, sustainable change tied to it. But if your spouse drags you to counseling, threatens a divorce or separation unless you go, how engaged are you going to be in that session on the couch? You're not.
That brings up a great point around how we facilitate change for other people, especially in partnerships where we keep growing throughout our life and where we might feel like we're aligned at one point. We have so many different influences that shift us throughout our time. But back even to like what we were first talking about in like corporate space or business space, how essential do you think it is? How much do you think we're going to see this shift toward self-awareness and mindfulness happening in successful workspaces?
It's going to happen, I think, in 2 spaces initially. Organizations that want to grow because of the predicament that they're in, and the organizations that have to grow to survive. So do they do the bare minimum, the path of least resistance, or do they say, the way that we operated up until March was great. We could slap a Band-Aid on that and maybe make it, but this is an opportunity for us, perhaps like, forget the title, the culture mentality, where the people get to bring, like self-organized work teams, they get to bring ideas to say, I could do my job so much better, so much more effectively and efficiently. And perhaps now working from home, they can, when that might not have been a consideration. Maybe for some people, virtual meetings are fantastic. But allowing, again, coming back to the individual and the self, trusting the experience that person has had, and being able then to step into it and to say, I have an idea of how we could improve this. Not just for me because I'd be more comfortable, but like for our department, for our division, for our bottom line. And how many times have organizations changed because somebody spoke up and said, there's a better way?
And how many times did they fall apart because somebody spoke up or many people spoke up and the person or the people at the top were like, yeah, well, sorry, you're not in a position to make changes. I mean, I guess I am going back to organization, because even today I had a phone call with the IRS actually, and they were telling me that they haven't had their systems updated in 20 years. And I just realized, like, how is it that I have the iPhone, whatever, the latest one, I can't even remember the name, and you've had the same system for 20 years, but you're the one in power. Like like the disparity is so great. So how come you have the worst system? It was just really fascinating to see that these structures of like, well, you can't reach the person at the top. There's no way I can talk to this person. I feel like this sets us up, or has set us up. I really believe that the future, this is just not going to be able to function very much longer with that kind of dynamic. So wouldn't you say that like creative stifling, or the ability to like have an expression that's heard, is in one way where we start lopping off even knowing ourselves from the beginning?
Yes, and the first word, as you described the IRS, was there's a mindset. if I worked for the IRS, there's a mindset, a limitation on the technology and the process and the culture and the bureaucracy. And you have a mindset of, well, wait a second, why can't I just sort of take care of all of this online, automate this process, and this become effective tomorrow morning? Why does it have to be, what's your fax number? Like, I haven't owned a fax machine in 25 years. So I'm using that word intentionally, mindset, to be aware of the mindset that we bring, either as the employee, the employer, the boss, the colleague, and then to say, do I trust my own mind in speaking up, or will I be shot down? Or will my boss take credit? I'll have a great idea, but it'll be my boss who then tells the president, hey, I thought of something great, and then they get promoted. And how that affects the health or the dis-ease of an organization and relationships. We're still people. We're not robots.
What's fascinating to me is how much I felt as a creative, I'll just say that word. I used to feel that like in traditional indigenous earth-based cultures, there are some cultures that didn't even have a word for love because it was so inherent to the fabric of their life, they didn't need one. And I always felt that about creativity. I was like, I don't even believe in that word because it just is everything to me. Mm-hmm. But, you know, as I got older, I started using the word creative, but because I feel it so much, I feel like it's a beyond word. But, you know, when we talk about ushering creative allowance into organizations or ushering in mindful awareness, these things have long been thought of as like luxurious peripheral aspects of function. But would you say from your experience in the corporate world and your experience working in a coaching capacity with organization that these things are not peripheral? Like where how central is the wellness of the individual members of a system to the system itself?
Often in many organizations, when there is change, formal change, they will call that person a champion internally. And the champion is the one who sponsors the change, often sometimes has to sell the change. And to other people, change is a 4-letter word. If we don't have someone who can not only have the ability to adopt a leadership, not a management, but a leadership position of curiosity, and then be able to navigate that and explore it. What's the resistance behind implementing good change and leading good change? If we don't have open-minded, bright, emotionally intelligent people, curious people, then those organizations, those relationships are going to suffer. It's the difference between an Apple and whatever the old IBM was. IBM got out of that business because other people built better computers than IBM. And not because the mechanics and the guts were different, but because the organization, Apple is just a radically different company. So now we're talking about, do you have people who think creatively and have a mindset for, we need to adapt and to integrate. And if people don't exist internally, it's going to be a struggle.
I think one of the beautiful pieces about that too is that a lot of times when we see a success like Apple, then other organizations, I know I was like, I'm not going to go into companies, but I love thinking about the psychology of companies. Yeah. Other companies might imitate another type of like similar corporate culture, but really creativity, there are influences, but there can't be imitations because it's response-based, right? It's saying, well, but we're here and they're there and they're selling computers, but we're selling, experiences or something else. And if we want to create community, we can't put it on people. We have to really have that thing you were saying that leaders need to have, which is that curiosity. And I love that. I love that, because when we realize that leadership takes creativity, and it takes responsiveness, and it takes going down to the nitty gritty, and having risk, and not being in this position of tyrannous power, and austere to the point of unreachable, then leadership is something we all have. We all have leadership, don't we?
Well, it's another word for agency. Do I believe that I can implement and enact change, whether that's losing 10 pounds or offering ideas at work, or back to my analogy, hey, honey, I'd really like to grow our marriage. And I'm wondering if you'd be open to having a dialogue with somebody about how we communicate, and the fact that, like, it's not effective the way that we're doing this. We're not happy. How differently that lands versus, hey, you're coming to counseling Tuesday night.
And it makes me think so much of that kind of dynamic, because I've definitely been on the we've got to do this or I'm out kind of therapy before. And honestly, that's not really the healthiest way to connect in relationship. It's not very respectful. In retrospect, of course, live and learn. The idea of, if you get a hard no on something, it's like, well, but this feels like an issue to me. How might we manage it elsewise? What other options do we have to heal through this, or to get closer? How would you imagine we might get closer? Sometimes that person might say, well, if you just get off my back and go away all the time and just talk to me once a day, then you have to kind of evaluate if that's the relationship for you or not, or whatever.
Oh, that hits a little close to home.
Oh, probably maybe on both sides. I don't know. But would you say it's important to have, before we can create the change, to kind of have a sense, almost like a frog, where our lily pad might be, where our safety is? How do we structure change?
Again, $1 million question. One of the ways that both I've used this corporately and clinically is working backwards and identifying who is it, not just what, but who is it that I want to be at the end of COVID? Who is it that I want to be at the end of this calendar year? Independent of everything else out there, I get to decide when I wake up on New Year's Eve. I chose in mid-June, this is the person that I want to be. And there's a lot of self-awareness now around racial unrest and tension, and how do we begin to have these conversations about white privilege that are super awkward and super important. And I think for me, what's been really helpful working with people and my own experience, where is it that I'm working from at the end? What is the target or the goal, and how is it that one step in that direction is actually a help of progress towards that end?
You just said something that I hadn't been able to articulate, but I knew it was up for me, because, and I realize it's in a way a privilege to even have that endpoint and to look backwards. And there's, for me, like the humility of, well, my endpoint has to just be my endpoint. I can't make it humanity's endpoint, because that's a lot of projection. I'm like, let's just all get along now and make it all better. And then how about privilege is just like the moment you actualize into any kind of formation that's considered alive. How about that's just privilege, and we're all there. Really, it's such an interesting piece around recognizing that we are all interconnected, and yet there's no fingerprint that's the same, and we are all unique, and that piece between there. But I love what you're saying, back to working from the end point, because for me, I'm someone who's created a lot, but I've never worked from the end point back to self, except for once when my mentor said to me in the middle of a journey that I went on, she said, well, who do you want to be when you get on the plane home? And I swear, Terry, I'd never lived backwards in a process before then, because that was doable.
Yeah.
Where do you want to be in 5 years? Like, that just makes my brain go down like a flight of stairs. I'm like, go get the book. It's so much for my brain. But just that week of how do you want to feel? That's incredible, Terry, that you're saying that, because do you think that sometimes when it's like we make one step in the right direction, even the like where I want to be has to be closer than the 5-year mark or the like at the end of my life? Like we have to bring it into like, where do I want to be at the end of the day today? Where do I want to be?
Absolutely. Right. What's the mindset for today? If today I woke up and I've got a throbbing migraine, I didn't plan that. Well, I could probably lay in bed all day, but if I want to get paid and I want to not be defined by a migraine, I just simply adapt and say, maybe my best day today is 2 clients. Maybe it's self-care. Maybe it's calling a friend and just saying, you know, I'm really curious what you hear if I were to just say, this is what's going on in my life, which, you know, kind of dovetails with working backwards, is I don't think we should do this work alone. Now, that may sound like the bias of a therapist and a consultant and a supervisor, but if we don't have a relationship that's trusted and secure, we talked about attachment, you and I, when we first met. If we don't have someone to work backwards with, there's no motivation often. When we hit that first roadblock, that first migraine, how easy is it then to say, it's not worth it? They said it was going to be easy, but it's actually a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. We need reinforcements. We were just built for relationship, not just performance, not just the doing, but coming back to the being. Who am I with in whatever this endeavor, this relationship, this project, this company?
I think that's so beautiful, especially even in ways where we've seemed in the past to almost iconicize people in contemporary society who did it on their own. They did it their way. And even for me as a woman, I have to get really honest with myself that because I am more, you know, we all have our own way of going toward connection and coming back to self, but because I recognize the human need, it's a humbling need for connection. I have fallen for men who don't need any connection, and I've envied the F out of them. But somewhere in the relationship, the envy point turns to criticism because there's such a walled off disconnection from needing anyone else. And we all need to be needed, I think, in a relationship, however we voice it or verse it, if we're comfortable using those words or not. We need to be needed. And so it's sort of important when we are in connection, whether it's company culture or culture with each other, or even looking in our own eyes in the mirror, to find a language that feels like we can be in ourself with the other. And being in ourself with the other, especially as speaking people, because I study the fact that the diaphragm ascends when we speak, there's totally a sense, it seems, of disassociation that is easy to lean toward in our communication. But to be able to maintain that sense of I'm here and you're here, in that middle space, it seems kind of imperative to technology even. I mean, it seems so primal, but it also seems so futuristic. And it seems like if we're going extreme in both directions, it must be important.
There's a phrase that I borrow from often from just a brilliant person that I've read and heard and watched. And one of their basic frames of reference is, we are born into this world as an infant. And when we are finally able to see and recognize mother's face, father's face, if it's relevant in this particular instance, as we grow, that infant child will be looking for someone who's looking for them. Whether that's in a room, in a crowd, on a screen. And the premise, the understanding that I have from this individual who said, we are always looking for someone looking for us, connection, attachment, it never ends.
I'm virtually hugging you. Or honoring you, however you feel honored.
Yeah, it rocked my world when I heard that, because I said, in one sentence, he has said more about what I have wanted and what many people I know, particularly like in our own families, how wonderful it is when someone's face lights up when they see you.
You know, I think though I've met people who are in denial of that.
Well, we're coming back now to what you and I talked about was initial trauma. And if there is a resistance and a reluctance to be seen and to be heard and to be known and not need anyone, then they will learn to perform without relationship.
Yeah. You know,
but it's not what their heart wants.
It's not what their heart wants, right? And so sometimes we don't even know our heart. I mean, that's, I think, for many of us, even the most intelligent in learning the mechanics of self-trust, a lot of these conversations have gone into learning how to feel resistance that's literally in and just outside of the heart, and stopping to pause and literally almost like you would hold a wounded bird to say, rather than go to where I want to be performing, to go where I'm having an obstacle of bringing my whole self into performance. If I get to performance, but I've left half of myself in these little dark holes or issues or whatever, then maybe it's necessary, if I want more feeling in my life, to actually go into these places where I'm skipping over and say, wait, I'm here. What do you feel? What is this? That curiosity piece. It's like we're leading. It's the leadership we have with our own internal company.
Self. Yep. If I have a self, and again, we talked very briefly about this, but if I have a self that I've worked on, and I've been seen, I've been heard, I've been given feedback, I've been challenged, I've been loved, I've been encouraged, and I know then what it's like to bring my full self, Brene Brown, vulnerability, wonderful. And then from a place of self-trust, I can begin to trust other people.
Wouldn't it be cool if CEOs on their resume said, yeah, I've been in a place where I've learned how to, all the things you just named, rather than I went to this school and that school, but yeah, I've recognized the value of love and connection, and I've touched these places in myself. Anyway, so before we part ways in this conversation at the moment, something you said to me in our second conversation, the longer conversation we had recently, we were talking about trauma and point of origin, and I'd asked you, well, what if we can't name the point? And I loved how you described we had the impact of trauma and then how we attach, and these are two pieces. I'd never thought of it, attachment in relationship to adjusting to trauma or how we get our needs met, and that some of the impact could literally just be the pattern we've then taken on and recreated. So you asked about going to the point of origin. I had the most amazing experience after we spoke. I was sleeping, woke up in the middle of the night, and I felt something in my body. And in my sleep, I went to a point of origin with it. I did what you said. And because I was sleeping, I was able to go somewhere. It was amazing. It was really in-body experience, an in-the-body experience, which I think is more riveting than the outer body experience sometimes, right? What's your experience been like to kind of go to the point of origin? Can you talk about the mechanics of that? How do we do it safely, even on our own? Or do we learn to do it with someone else and then we can do it on our own? Do we just have to do it once? How the F do we do it?
Well, I think part of it is the work that we're willing to do to ask ourselves hard questions. Am I willing to step into the healing that will not be transactional? I'm often working with folks who are victims of childhood abuse. And it wasn't a capital T, wasn't just a capital T trauma, because that was the abuse, but it was the lack of connection, the lack of safety, the lack of security, the lack of empathic compassion, which is the small t of the pervasive climate of the house was cold and disconnected. My dad would come home and he wouldn't even look at me, versus the horror of abuse. Both are trauma. How do we do that work? Well, if we're willing, again, coming into the place of ready, willing, and able to do that work, you can do some good work on your own about locating what is it that you'd like to have healed, clinically, physically, metaphorically, emotionally. And then again, what would it like to be with someone who knows how to navigate that path?
What would it be like to, I didn't understand, what would it?
Yeah, once you've asked yourself those questions about where is it that I really want to feel that healing, then who are the people? Is it a support group? Is it a mentor? Is it a pastor? Is it a best friend? Is it a sibling or a parent? Is it a coach? Is it a therapist? Who is it that I'm willing to engage and walk into this so that I can begin to form a sense of self about how I'm experienced? Because other people have experiences of us that are their reality. And then how do we integrate those two? My understanding, my awareness, and their experience. It doesn't have to be formal and paid. It can be with people who have earned the deep trust that we have in our life with them. And for some folks, they want an objective, professional, trained, experienced opinion, someone who does this work. And I think both are relevant, both the ability to journal and to step into those places when we have and make space, and then the people that we're willing to engage our story with.
I wish for everybody, for all of us who had any need that wasn't met or any sense of not being seen or cared for, that we have the opportunity to create a more healing-centric world where, the wholeness of who we are can show up. And it's interesting, even as you said that, there was something you said that lit up for me. And I thought about the sense of identity we often carry is one that we made a long time ago, even as a child in our implicit years or early days. And there can be so many narratives going on around how that person needs to behave or is behaving, or what needs she needs to have met. But then if we are able to know ourselves through whatever practices, whatever counseling, whatever circumstance or life change or self-connection, we get to kind of have a sense of our essence and the values that might come out of that. I mean, wouldn't you say in a way that values come out of recognizing your essence and then orienting some possible markers that might help you feel your essence, your best sense of wholeness as most as you can on the planet?
How would you see and interpret essence, Leslie?
I love that question, Terry. It's interesting because I had an interview yesterday with a phenomenal healer, someone who really blew my mind in his offering to the world. And he comes from a traditional medicine perspective. And he was saying that both in Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, he practices both,
the medicines are really built to nourish the essence of the person. I forget the name of the essence, but it has a great name in Sanskrit. Ojas, I think, O-J-A-S, O-J-A-S. And I think that some of these ancient traditional wisdoms have really good working definitions for these pieces. You know, I draw upon them a lot, even in a recent space of masterclass where we talked about even like how to understand the masculine principle, not the gender masculine, but the masculine we all have and the feminine and the movement between them, interchange between the yin and the yang. Basically like the tides, the sun and the moon are always changing places. It's never like the sun just moves and the moon's like, you know what, today I don't want to. It's they just do. And this is two things that are operating together. They sort of transcend the dichotomy.
Yeah.
So you talk about essence, you know, I can do my best with like the analytical Western mind, and I think that that's valuable too, but it's really a felt sense to me. It's a felt sense that I think for each person, we come to it at our own time in our own way. I feel fortunate that mine was very internalized, very much found on my own, somehow with nature, but also even in a place that felt like sacred for me when I was little, through music. The things that allowed me to have a feeling of safety and wholeness and what I felt there. That would be my essence. And even if I never was able to develop it, let's say I was somebody who never was able to develop it, I can still say, wait, all right, maybe I'm somebody who, let's say, is going through complete chronic depression, like I'm done, just check me out, sign me out. But there's one thing that sounds good to them. Maybe that thing is just freaking peanut butter. What does that mean to you? How do we get closer to it? So I think we can get closer to it by our senses. We infer it through the senses. So I think it has to do with sense acuity and a sense of center. And I just really see it as an asterisk. And I have my own relationship to it. And I think we can also have an affected relationship with essence. It can be held in developmental childishness, like mine was. Like, oh, my essence is magical and pure. And, you know, I still sometimes hold on to that, and it's funny. Or like all these different ways people experience different qualities that we are holding on to that aren't even true to our nature, right? The outer perception of who we are. And sometimes we might feel like we have to sear our essence in different ways, but I think really it's about shedding our own personas that we've had around our essence and coming back to something that is very human. And that's an interesting piece when it comes to change, because the only thing about human being or sentience is that life is change. And so we are always evolving and changing. And, you know, now we're moving more toward this real cyborgian AI reality, and I try to work really hard with all sorts of experience to get rid of this is good or this is bad, because I think that can keep us out of our essence. So I really do think it has to do with semblance and creating wholeness and doing whatever it is we have to do to find that. You know, even somebody like the man who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, whose last name I'm forgetting, but Viktor
Frankl.
I mean, I didn't get through all that book yet because it was so intense, but the fact that he found some sort of organizational meaning, or, I mean, as intense as that is, like, just to, I want to hope that no matter where we are, there's a place that we can find our essence. Do you think it's true? Do you think that there's places where we can't find our essence? It's too impossible.
Well, as you helped me expand how I might have heard or interpreted essence, I wondered on some level if essence and self aren't synonymous.
I like that. When I like that, I'm like, let's do a Dan Siegel and get 200 specialists together and figure out what essence is. But, you know, I like that, except for when I think of self, I think of a body. Do you think of a body?
I think it's one part. You know, in Dan's, I wrote Dan's definition down because I came back to it before we met, and it's an emergent self-organizing, embodied and relational process of regulation of energy and information.
That's the exact same definition he gave for mind.
That is mind, right?
I can't believe you read that because I wrote it down yesterday and it was so cool because it was like a point in our previous conversation and I was like, I got to look at these 9 things. And then it led me to that and I can't believe you just read that to me.
Yeah.
So do you think mind and self then are the same?
Well, they're not opposites, are they?
I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation because my sense is that our mind is what makes sense, what's making sense of self and input. It's like the metabolizing facet of this of self in our regulation of self and other. The mind is saying, okay, what's happening now? What's happening?
Can you have one without the other? Can you have a self without essence and essence without self?
Oh, self and essence. I like this combination, but self and mind, I wouldn't.
Mm-mm.
That's what I was asking. Because what you
Self.
definition of was Dan Siegel's definition of mind, but I thought you were reading the definition of self.
Well, that's mind.
Okay.
What I'm just wondering is if self and essence can exist independently.
I think it depends on who you're talking to. I mean, I'm just thinking of like 4th grade teacher of mine who'd be like, Leslie, you gotta march yourself right up to the I don't think she was talking about my essence. I don't think she cared if my essence was going or not. But I think that's a really good thing to kind of consider because it's a really whole and kind of loving way to kind of figure out what our needs are every day.
Yeah.
Wow. Terry Bohn, everybody. Thank you. With Terry, I'm so lucky because I know you don't do interviews very easily. I'm clear on that. And as it took me a bunch of writing to you to get you here, and I'm so thankful to have you here. And I really hope that people get to really listen to this sharing that you provided today. Where can people learn about your work? Are you open to like people flying in and doing a week of work with you? Like, how do you operate?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of changing a couple of things because of COVID. One is individual work and couples work, which is pretty regular, pretty locally based. Others, because of telehealth, serving clients in Colorado and Washington in a clinical way, where I am a therapist for them in those 2 states. Increasingly doing targeted intensives where we work together for several days. People fly in, people drive in, and then, beyond that, to do what might feel more left brain coaching and consulting with both leadership and entrepreneurs, helping them either with their own vision of what they're wanting to do or with organizational things, because I've led change leadership projects in my past. But I just love to collaborate. I mean, I think the reason that I was so attracted to this opportunity is that you just bring a language and an invitation to play with words that is so uncommon in so much of what I listen to. It just felt like an organic conversation that we had.
I'm just so glad to get to have this space with you now. And so tell me here, and I'll also put the notes below, where people can go to work with you. Yeah,
the best way to get, again, this sort of version that's going to exist through the summer as I anticipate some different offerings in the fall after Labor Day, terrybohn.com, terrybohn.com. And there's a place to contact me to propose how we might collaborate. And I love conversations like this and the opportunity to work with people who want to heal and grow.
I'm so excited for the work that you offer in the world, and I selfishly really hope that you get to work a lot with men, because I think that men are going through a beautiful rite of passage right now, men of all expressions of menness. And I still believe in great men, and you're an example of one. And so I'm so thankful to have this space with you. It's so warm. I described it to somebody who I was in a meeting with earlier because I was readying for our meeting, and I feel really soothed in your presence. And I think that that's a real gift that you give. So thank you for giving that gift.
Leslie, thank you. It's been a privilege and a delight to be with you again.